Millions of Muslims flee to Europe every year. Cities like London, Paris, Berlin, Stockholm, and Brussels are beginning to see their national languages disappear. Schools where native children are a minority. Districts that operate under religious law instead of state law. This is not immigration, it is replacement, and it is happening faster than anyone predicted. But this is not the worst part. All European leaders knew this was going to happen. They had the data, they saw the projections, they watched it unfold in real time. And they didn't just allow it, they accelerated it. The question is not whether Europe is being destroyed. Anyone with eyes can see it. The question is why those in power wanted it to be this way. Because once you understand the true reason why Europe opened its borders, everything makes sense. There is a logic behind it all. A calculated ideological mission that began 70 years ago. And by the end of this video, you will know exactly what it is, who benefits from it, and why it may already be too late to stop it. To understand why Europe keeps its doors open, we need to go back to 1945. The continent lay in ruins. Not just physically, but morally. 50 million people were dead. Cities were rubble. And the ideologies that had dominated Europe, nationalism, racial superiority, cultural dominance, had led directly to the gas chambers. The trauma fundamentally rewired how European elites thought about identity. They looked at what nationalism had produced and decided it was poison. They looked at their colonial past and saw exploitation. So they made a choice. They would build a new Europe, one that rejected everything the old Europe stood for. This is when the idea emerged that would shape everything. The belief that all cultures are equal, that no civilization has the right to claim superiority, that diversity strengthens society. It wasn't just political correctness, it was a genuine attempt to prevent another Holocaust. And for the first few decades, this vision seemed to work. Europe needed workers. Turks came to Germany, North Africans to France, Pakistanis to Britain. Everyone told themselves the same story. These are temporary workers. Integration isn't necessary because they won't stay. But they did stay. And their families came. And suddenly Europe faced a question it hadn't considered. What do you do when millions from completely different civilizations make your country home? The old Europe would have demanded assimilation. Learn our language, adopt our values, become one of us or leave. But the new Europe couldn't say that. Because demanding assimilation felt like the cultural imperialism they had sworn to reject. So instead, they created multiculturalism. The idea that immigrants shouldn't have to change at all. That they could maintain their language, customs, values, even legal systems, and somehow coexist peacefully. It was a beautiful theory, but it required something impossible. Cultures with fundamentally incompatible values sharing the same space without conflict. Let's talk about what actually happened. Take Britain. In the 1960s, London was culturally homogeneous. Today, white British people are a minority in their own capital. Less than 45% of London's population identifies as white British. In some boroughs, below 20%. The numbers are staggering. In 1991, the UK's Muslim population was around 950,000. By 2021, it jumped to over 3.9 million. That's quadrupling in 30 years. Projections suggest Britain's Muslim population could reach 13 million by 2050, nearly 17% of the total. But numbers don't tell the real story. What matters is concentration and lifestyle. What happened wasn't integration, it was parallel societies. Entire neighborhoods became ethnic enclaves, places where English is barely spoken, where schools are 95% Muslim, where Sharia councils operate as informal legal systems, where community leaders hold more authority than officials. Bradford, Birmingham, Manchester. These aren't diverse neighborhoods, they're separate worlds inside Britain. The same pattern repeats across Europe. In France, the Paris suburbs became lost territories, areas where French law struggles to operate, where police need backup, where the state surrendered control. In Germany, Turkish and Syrian populations created districts where German culture disappeared. In Sweden, authorities recognized over 60 vulnerable areas. Diplomatic language for neighborhoods where Swedish law no longer reliably applies. Places with their own rules, hierarchies, systems of justice operating outside European democracy. This wasn't supposed to happen. The multicultural project assumed people would mix, that they would adopt European values of gender equality, religious tolerance, individual freedom. that exposure to Western society would transform traditional mindsets. But the opposite occurred. Many immigrant communities became more conservative in Europe than in their home countries. Maintaining traditional values became resistance, a way to preserve identity in a culture that felt alien. The cultural gap didn't close, it widened, and with each generation, tension grew. Now the part nobody wants to discuss: the concrete impact on European society. Not in diplomatic language, in measurable ways affecting ordinary people's lives. Let's start with crime. In Sweden, migrants make up about 20% of the population, but account for over 50% of those convicted of serious crimes. Sexual assault cases involving foreign-born perpetrators increased so dramatically that Sweden went from one of the lowest rape rates in Europe to one of the highest. Germany, New Year's Eve 2015 in Cologne. Over 1,200 women reported sexual assault in organized attacks by groups predominantly of North African and Middle Eastern origin. The initial response from authorities was to downplay it, to avoid connecting attacks to immigration policy. Britain's grooming gang scandal revealed something worse. For years, organized groups, predominantly of Pakistani origin, systematically exploited thousands of young British girls in towns like Rotherham and Rochdale. Authorities knew, social workers knew, police knew, but they didn't act because they feared being called racist. They prioritized protecting the multicultural narrative over protecting children. European institutions allowed children to be abused rather than confront cultural dimensions of crime. That's not tolerance. That's moral cowardice. But crime is only part. The economic impact is equally severe. Across Europe, immigrant populations from outside the EU have significantly higher unemployment and lower workforce participation. In Germany, nearly half of long-term unemployed are foreign-born. In France, unemployment among non-European immigrants runs 2 to 3 times higher than natives. In Sweden, after 10 years, fewer than half of refugees from certain regions found employment. This creates enormous fiscal burden. These populations require housing, healthcare, education, social services, but contribute far less in taxes than they consume. Studies in Denmark showed non-Western immigrants cost the state approximately $4.5 billion annually. The welfare systems Europeans spent generations building are being drained by populations that never contributed and show little prospect of becoming net contributors. So if results have been this problematic, why hasn't Europe changed course? It's not one reason. It's ideology, economics, and political calculation creating a system almost impossible to reform. First, ideology. European elites genuinely believe in multiculturalism as a moral imperative. Restricting immigration based on cultural compatibility would mean admitting not all cultures are equal. It would acknowledge Western values of individual freedom, gender equality, religious tolerance are superior to traditional Islamic values of collective honor and patriarchal authority. They cannot allow themselves to think that, because admitting Western civilization has something worth defending means confronting that multiculturalism might be destroying it. Every failure is blamed on racism, inequality, lack of funding, never on fundamental incompatibility of imported values. There's also economics. European birth rates collapsed. Italy, Spain, Germany all have fertility below replacement level. The population ages rapidly. Welfare systems, pensions, healthcare depend on young workers supporting older generations. Immigration is sold as the solution. Bring young workers to fill the demographic gap, to pay taxes funding pensions, to keep the economy running. Except this logic has a fatal flaw. It only works if immigrants integrate into the labor market and become productive contributors. That's not happening. Instead of solving the demographic crisis, mass immigration creates a parallel crisis where welfare systems are strained by populations consuming more than contributing. Then politics. Europe's political establishment made mass immigration the defining feature of their moral identity. Reversing course means admitting decades of policy were catastrophic mistakes, that they sacrificed their societies on the altar of a beautiful theory that didn't work. No politician wants to admit that. So they manage decline. Small adjustments, more integration programs, more funding for language classes, commissions to study the problem, but never addressing the fundamental issue. Never asking whether maintaining European identity is possible while importing millions who reject European values and fear. not of immigrants, of their own population. Across Europe, ordinary citizens watch with growing alarm. When they voice concerns, they're labeled racists, xenophobes, far-right extremists. The establishment made questioning immigration policy socially and professionally dangerous. That suppression creates pressure, and it's flowing into populist movements the establishment can't control. Is there any way out? Europe is trapped. Current policy is unsustainable. Social tension rises. Economic burden grows. Cultural fragmentation deepens. But changing course seems impossible because the entire system denies there's a problem. However, one country did something different. Denmark. Once among the most liberal on immigration, it completely reversed course. In 2001, Denmark elected a center-right government prioritizing immigration control. The real shift came when even Social Democrats adopted strict policies. Today, Denmark has Europe's toughest immigration laws. Limited family reunification. Immigrants must work and contribute for years before accessing full welfare. Controversial policies for ghetto neighborhoods with stricter rules. They made clear that certain behaviors, forced marriage, honor violence, refusal to integrate, won't be tolerated regardless of cultural background. And it worked. Not perfectly. But Denmark avoided the worst outcomes plaguing Sweden, Germany, France. Crime rates in immigrant communities decreased. Integration improved. The fiscal burden stabilized. And Danish people maintained confidence in their government. Denmark shows immigration is possible while maintaining social cohesion. But it requires what most of Europe refuses: demanding assimilation. Saying clearly immigrants are welcome, but must adopt Danish values. Learn the language, accept gender equality, respect secular law above religious law. And if they won't, they're not welcome. Compare that to the rest of Europe. Merkel's 2015 decision to accept over 1 million refugees accelerated German transformation in irreversible ways. France's fierce secularism failed, preventing Islamist influence in suburbs. Sweden's humanitarian narrative crashed against gang violence and segregation. Britain's multiculturalism produced a capital where natives are a minority. These aren't distant problems. They're happening now, getting worse. Because immigrant children, supposed to integrate, often feel even less European than their parents. They grow between two worlds, belonging to neither. Their frustration manifests in alienation, radicalization, sometimes violence. The multicultural promise was everyone could maintain identity while sharing common citizenship. But citizenship without shared identity is just legal status. It's not enough to hold society together. So why does Europe remain the most tolerant continent? Because tolerance became Europe's defining feature after World War II. Because admitting tolerance has limits means confronting truths the establishment spent decades denying. Because managing decline feels preferable to admitting failure. And because the alternative, closing borders, demanding assimilation, defending European values unapologetically, feels too much like the nationalism that led to catastrophe. But here's the final truth. By refusing to defend their culture, Europeans aren't preventing nationalism's return. They're guaranteeing it. Because ordinary people see what's happening in their neighborhoods. They experience consequences elites insulate themselves from. And when the mainstream refuses to address concerns, they turn to alternatives promising to fix everything. Alternatives often far more extreme than necessary. Modern Europe's tragedy is creating a false choice. Either embrace mass immigration without conditions or be labeled fascist. Either accept your society's transformation or be cast as bigot. The question facing Europe now isn't whether it should be tolerant, it's whether tolerance requires accepting intolerance. What happens next determines whether European civilization survives in recognizable form, because tolerance isn't sustainable when only one side practices it. Openness cannot endure when exploited by those rejecting its principles, and a society refusing to defend itself will eventually be replaced by one that will. That's the real answer to why Europe remains tolerant despite massive immigration and obvious problems. Not because the policy works, but because admitting failure would shatter the entire post-war European identity, and the people in charge would rather watch their civilization transform beyond recognition than confront that truth. The doors remain open. The population keeps changing. And every year, Europe looks less like the continent that built the modern world, and more like competing communities sharing geography but nothing else. Time will tell if that's transition to something new or simply the end of something old. But what's certain is that the Europe emerging from this transformation will be fundamentally different from the one that existed for 1,000 years. Future generations will ask how this happened. How did one of history's most powerful civilizations allow itself to be transformed so completely, so quickly? The answer will be simple but devastating. They valued tolerance more than survival. They feared being called racist more than losing their identity. And by the time they realized the cost, it was already too late to change course without tearing their societies apart. That is the story of European tolerance. It is not a strength, but a weakness disguised as a virtue. And like all weaknesses, it is being exploited by those who understand that the will to survive is more important than the desire to be liked. Now it's your turn. Tell me, what do you really think about the current situation in Europe? Do you think this will change, or will it continue until tolerance collapses? Subscribe to the channel if you are against immigration, and see you in the next video. Have a great day.